Hey there, I'm Joe Weems. Before we get into the video, I want to remind you about ng-conf 2023 happening in Salt Lake City, Utah on June 14th and 15th. Head over to ng-conf.org to check out the speakers, check out the talks, and to get your ticket before they all sell out. We'll see you there.
Let's get started. So before, today is going to be a hands-on workshop. If you guys want to go ahead and begin to clone the repo, if you haven't already done so, that's the URL. Or you could take a picture of the QR code. Go ahead, clone it, run npm install. Not sure what the internet situation is here, but give you guys a head start on that. But today's talk is going to be Cypress for Angular devs, hands-on workshop. And we kind of broke today's workshop into 3 parts. So the first part is going to be a little like intro about Cypress. Most of you have probably heard of Cypress, using Cypress. So we're gonna keep this pretty brief, but wanted to highlight it if you're not using it or not familiar with it, or maybe it's a good refresher for those of you who are using it, some of the features about it. Then we're going to, in the second part, we're going to do a hands-on migrating an application that's using Protractor to Cypress. And the third part, we're going to have you guys demo, basically working on component testing with Cypress, a feature we released just 2 weeks ago. My name is Jordan Powell, and this is my
Ely Lucas.
Yeah, awesome colleague Ely Lucas. We're both developer experience engineers here at Cypress, and reach out to us. There's our Twitters. If you guys have questions about Cypress or whatever you want to talk about, reach out to us. We'd love to chat.
We'll throw a little shout out tomorrow at the meet and greet the speakers lunch, and Jordan and I are going to be at one of the tables. So if you have any additional questions, you can come find us tomorrow at that event.
Absolutely. Or we have a booth literally like right outside this door, so we'll be hanging out there as well. So let's start first a little bit by talking about Cypress. I always think it's good to give context and like sort of answer the why before you like start just like writing code. So for those of you who don't know, if you've ever had to do like browser testing, end-to-end testing, things like that, before Cypress, you had to make a lot of choices. One of those being you had to pick a framework, something like Mocha, Jasmine, QUnit, or Karma. You then had to pick an assertion library. Do I want to use Chive? Maybe I want to use Expect.js, something like that. And then, well, you need a Selenium wrapper. So we're going to use Protractor, which maybe a lot of you have used before, maybe Nightwatch or WebDriver, other popular Selenium wrappers. And then you may need some additional things like sign-on or test double, just to name a few things, a few decisions that you had to make along the way. But that's where Cypress came in, and we said, we want to like tackle this problem. So what sets Cypress apart, besides all that stuff? Like what sets it apart from other testing libraries? For one, it provides time traveling. So Cypress takes snapshots as your tests run. Something that I have found very, very helpful at using Cypress. This is probably one of my favorite. You get debuggability, which is a hard thing to say. Debuggability really fast a lot of times. So when you're running your tests in the browser with Cypress, in Chrome, Firefox, whatever browser you use, you get the same developer tools that you're already using for building your applications right in there. Your network tag, your console log, all the things that you normally use as a developer, you get all those things, which I find very, very awesome when you're trying to debug your applications and your tests. Real-time reloads. So like many frameworks, when you update a test and press save, it'll automatically rerun in Cypress. Automatic waiting. This is a huge one for those of you who have come from Selenium, Protractor, something like that. You don't have to wait with Cypress. You don't have to do any more waits of guessing how many milliseconds it's going to take, and then it fails, and then you change it, for another 1,000 milliseconds. You don't have to do that because of the way we architected Cypress. You get spies, stubs, and clocks, and screenshots and videos. So when your tests fail, you get recorded videos as well as snapshots of those tests to make fixing those tests as easy as possible. Currently, these are the supported browsers that we have with Cypress. So Firefox, Chrome, Edge, and Brave, as well as Electron. And as of our next release, we will now have support for WebKit, which is something, it's been one of our most outstanding issues on a repo for a long time. So you'll be able to use Safari and any WebKit browser. Woo! We also recently, as of June 1st, released Cypress 10.0, which added a new type of testing. Historically, Cypress has basically its bread and butter has been end-to-end testing. And it still is. It's still something we value greatly. But we saw a gap in the way developers were writing tests in their applications. And so we decided to build component testing, which runs basically the same way end-to-end testing does, but you're testing isolated components by themselves, isolated in the browser, exactly the way a user is going to interact with them. And we'll get more into detail with that later. So today we're going to highlight 3 features that we've been working on at Cypress that we think will help Angular developers like yourselves write tests with Cypress. So one being our Cypress schematic, which will help do certain things, scaffold out, convert from Protractor to Cypress, generate end-to-end tests, component tests, a lot of just how schematics work. They do schematic things, but it's very tailored for Angular developers using Cypress. We'll also have a learning tool that we created called the Cypress Migrator, which we'll use to help migrate your Protractor tests into Cypress, and you guys will see that here in a little bit. As well as component testing, a feature we released just 2 weeks ago in Cypress, 10.5. So now to part 2, migrating to Cypress from Protractor. So why Cypress, right? Well, when you run Protractor, you get this little error that says Protractor has been deprecated. So as of Angular, the next one, 15, I believe, it's going to be deprecated. Or it is deprecated, but the Angular team is no longer going to add support for this. I know Hero devs, I think, are going to keep a fork of Protractor, so you don't have to worry it's not like going away, but I'm biased, but I think there's still a lot of benefits to using Cypress. So this talk is not a sales pitch on why you should use Cypress, but it's like our objective to show you, if you make the decision, like how easy it is to make that switch. So we have a doc guide on our docs that really breaks down very detailed a lot of questions you may have about why you would switch to Cypress from Protractor, how to get started, working with the DOM, how to do assertions, some of the benefits, all those things. We don't have time to go into those today, but wanted to just throw this for you. If you have questions, that's a great resource to point to. We're going to then use the Cypress Migrator, which I just talked about. Here's a quick screenshot of what that looks like. And you're going to see you put Protractor code in, and it gives you the matching Cypress code. We're also going to use the Cypress schematic, which we mentioned. And we're here to meet the heroes. So Eli, let's do a quick demo.
All righty then. So just real quick again, here is the link to the repo in case you didn't grab it before. The way that we're going to work the demos in the labs here, I'm going to kind of walk through the demo and do it live, and then we're going to break and have you all try the demo itself. So you're going to get to see it happen and then get to do it yourself. We hope that's a really good learning experience for you all, and we're also going to be around to help. We got myself and we got Jordan, and we also have several other members from the Cypress DX team that will be walking around. If you see somebody in a Cypress shirt, go ahead and be like, hey, I have a question, come help me. If you see somebody in a Cypress hat, we've been giving those out, so they may not actually be a Cypress person. All right, so let me get started here real quick, and that is absolutely dark, isn't it? All right, that looks like it's probably better. Let me get set up here real quick. We may or may not have been force pushing to this repo 20 minutes before this lab started, trying to get everything, make sure it was running, so.
We won't say why, right?
No, we might break some rules of conduct if that came about. Okay, so in the lab, you're gonna wanna make sure you're in the lab 1 start folder. And let me fire up the app real quick and show you what you got. npm run start. And so this app, if you've ever done the tutorial on the main Angular website, the Tour of Heroes app, this is kind of like our take of Tour of Heroes. And work. There we go. This is the wrong project. No wonder it's not working. He's not here.
There we go.
There we go. So here is our Tour of Heroes. And this is an example app that we're working on developing and kind of fleshing out a little bit to give like a really good example of what it would be like to write Cypress tests on a full-featured app. So this app, it actually has a real backend with a real database. It has authentication and a couple of different screens. We wanted to make it complex enough to simulate a real-world scenario, but simple enough so that you could be able to hop in and work with it and not have it be too complicated. So here we have a list of heroes, and these heroes, so the app, it's kind of like Uber, but for superheroes. You get to see a list of heroes, and then if you're interested in hiring one, you can. But in order to hire one, you have to be logged into the app. So I'll go ahead and click this, and you can see like, hey, you have to be logged in to hire the hero. And so we'll go over here and log in, and we'll do, there's 2 users set up in the system. There's test@test.com, which is a normal user, and test123 is gonna be the password. All of that is in the readmes and stuff for you, so you don't have to remember it. But now we can hire the smoker. And we're gonna give bonus points if you're able to identify from the Cypress crew that are here who are the actual heroes of the application. All right, so we got the smoker. We're gonna hire him, and then you can see the number of saves went up because we hired him and he went out and saved the day. And then you can like him and go up. And as an admin user, which is admin, not Adam, at test.com. Test 1, 2, 3. We have the ability to create new heroes, to edit heroes, and whatnot. So if you're looking for an app to like really dig into Cypress and write an end-to-end tests and component tests, this is a good starting place to go. And it's what we're going to dig in a little bit in the workshops, but we're going to be expanding on it, and of course you can expand on it on your own. Okay, so but the first thing that I want to show off here is that this app has protractor tests in it currently. And we're going to give those a run to see what they look like real quick. Cypress Workshop. Very client. Okay, so I'm going to run the ng-e2e command, which is going to fire up Protractor. And you can see we got, you can't see any of that. We got the migration error, but this, I think, I get this error almost every single time I try to start up Protractor for some reason, this econ reset. So if you do run into this, we also had other people going through the lab run into it. Just run it again. It should work. And we can see it popped up. We can see it ran through some tests. We can see it passed some tests. And I think it's all good because it was all green. I didn't get much of a chance to see what it was doing, but that's okay. Let's see what it would be like to convert this spec over into Cypress, though, using the Cypress Migrator tool. So the spec is going to be in the end-to-end folder here in the app.e2e-spec.js file. And so here is the test. But what we're going to want to do first is we're going to want to get Cypress up and running inside of this application. And to do so, we're going to use the Cypress Angular schematic to install Cypress and to get everything all set up for us. To do so, I'm actually going to do this in code so you can see it better. We're going to say we're going to go into the client folder because that is where the Angular app is at. And we're going to say ng-add @cypress/schematic. It's going to tell us that, hey, we found the schematic. Would you like to have it installed? And I'm going to hit yes. And it's going to take you through a few other questions on how far you want it to go setting up your application. So it's going to ask if I want to replace the ng-e2e command. I'm going to say no right now because I still want my Protractor test to live alongside my, my Cypress test as I'm doing a conversion. And then it's going to ask if we want to set up component testing. I'm also going to say to this no now because we have a whole section on component testing later. But once it's done, it tells you all the files that it created for you and now how it's ready to go. So I'll load this up. I'll say npx cypress open. And here we go. We can come up into here and we could go to end-to-end, hit continue a couple times. And now we got the choose your browser. And so I'm going to say I want to test in Chrome. I'll come over here to end-to-end test, and we can see we have a default spec file in here. And we can see that it's erroring, and it's erroring off the bat because we need to set up a base URL to tell it this where our website is and what port it's listening on. And so to do so, we'll go into our configuration file, which is cypress.config.ts. And we'll add the base URL. And this is going to be http://localhost port 3000. Oh, and I need to make sure I add this into the E2E section. There we go. And then once I do it, you can see that as soon as we save the configuration file, Cypress detected that. It reloads itself so it gets all the latest values. I'll click on the spec, and we can see the app is running. Oh, I'm not running. Yeah, I got the wrong port. 4200. There we go. So now we're visiting the site, but this test is going to fail because it's looking for text that currently isn't in this app. But that's okay because we're getting ready to replace this test with the Protractor test. So here's our Protractor test. I'm going to grab the describe block, and I'm going to go to our migration tool. Now our migration tool, it's not really meant to be like have it run on your entire website and convert everything all at once. It's more of a learning tool. Okay. And so I'm going to paste the test, the Protractor test, over here on the left, and then I'm going to say migrate to Cypress. And it's going to take the Protractor code, migrate it into Cypress code, and then down below, we're going to give you links to documentation on all the commands that were used to create the Cypress test. So if you're new to Cypress and you're getting started, you can be like, oh, what does a site.visit do? And what does a site.title do? And so on, so you can learn. But now you can take the code, I'll hit copy over here, and go into my Cypress spec. spec.sci.ts. I'll replace this default one with the new one. And come over here and let it run. And you can see that it executed all 3 tests. One of the nice things about Cypress is we do have this time traveling that we take a snapshot after every single command. So you can come in here and see what's going on by clicking on this. Like, let's go to this login one. It'll be a little bit more interesting. But we can say, hey, we're getting the login. And so you can see it's highlighted, the login button that it's getting. We're clicking it so you can see the little red dot of where it's clicking. And then the modal is going to pop up. Now, something that's happening here is we're getting the login, and the code, we're immediately saying, hey, get me the login email. But since this is loading up in a modal, it's not quite there yet. Well, Cypress has automatic waiting, where if the element doesn't exist in the DOM yet, it will wait for up to 4 seconds for that to exist in the DOM before it airs out. So like Jordan was saying earlier, you don't have to worry about writing your own wait commands to wait for things to appear and whatnot. And then we'll type in test@test.com, get the password, type in test, hit sign in, and then we basically verify that the logout button exists. All right, and so that is creating or running the Cypress Migrator tool. And so if you go into Lab 1, I've got so many windows open here. We'll leave this up as well. We're going to take about 10-15 minutes for you to run through this. We're going to be walking around, answering questions and whatnot. So please feel free to reach out and see if you have any questions.
Alrighty. I know some of you guys are still getting things installed. These are always really difficult to get everyone's machines working locally and so forth. But we do have those labs branches at the start and the end of lab 1, 2, and 3. So feel free to go back and rerun these again if you like. This guide is we have links for, so you guys can do that anytime you want. But to keep moving so that we can kind of stay on track with all the things we wanted to cover, we're going to talk, or I'm going to talk a minute about component testing. And so the important thing to note here, like, what are the differences between end-to-end testing and component testing? So the way I like to look at it is end-to-end testing provides the most like bang for your buck. You're testing a lot of things, how they interact and integrate with each other, the client to the API to the database. You're testing how they all work together as one unit. But there are some trade-offs with that. They take a little longer to run. The more parts that are involved, the more brittle they can eventually become. But with end-to-end testing, I like to think of it as user journey. So you want to test the critical things that your users are doing in your applications. So one would be like, let's take some sort of online shopping app. So a user is going to visit your website and they're going to search for a product. They're going to add some product to your shopping cart. They're going to enter shipping information. They're going to maybe enter payment information, and then they're going to complete their order. That's like an entire user flow. It's an example of something that you would do an end-to-end test over. Obviously, if you are a website that collects money and it depends upon people buying things, you don't want those things to be broken. So every time you make changes, those are like critical things that you want to make sure work, right? Because I don't like to get phone calls at 3 in the morning from someone saying, hey, our website's down and we're not making money. You know, those are things that end-to-end tests really focus on solving. With component tests, it's different because we're not thinking about the entire journey of a user, but the individual components along the way. So in the same example, we may have a component test for the search bar component, maybe a button component that you click, maybe the product details component, a form input component, the address form component. You get the point. All the little components that our apps are composed of that we'll test in isolation. And so we used to build applications, in form of like pages, right? And so we used to say, I need an about page, and we would just shove code in an about page, and then we needed a home page and a contact page or whatever our apps do. We would think of them in terms of pages. But over time, with the adoption of frameworks like Angular, we've sort of migrated to a very component-driven development approach where we no longer think of our applications like pages, but more like this, where they're comprised of individual components that sort of encapsulate and isolate logic as well as styling, all the things that we care about in a small little pieces, right? And so one of the other things that I love about component testing is that it really enforces test-driven development. And so what I mean by that is when you're creating a component, if you use component testing from the beginning, you get this sort of like really quick feedback where you mount the component you're testing in Cypress, and then you go back and you say, I need to adjust the styles, I need to add validation, whatever. And when you save, you automatically get this real-time, very quick feedback. And you don't have to serve up your application, wait for it to build, go to the route, click on this thing to get to the component you care about over and over and over again. You get this component in isolation directly in Cypress that's updated really, really quickly. So you get this very quick feedback loop. The other thing that I like about component testing as well is that it really enforces this idea of shifting left. And it's something we talk about a lot at Cypress. And the idea is we used to think of software in terms of this path, right? Where we would have system requirements that would then turn to software requirements. Once we had software requirements, we'd turn it to analysis, then we'd do program design. Then once we had that, we'd say, okay, let's code this thing. And then we'd hey, we should probably write some tests. Maybe it's manual, maybe it's automated test. And then we send it to production, right? That's great. However, we really believe that testing should be shifted left in this diagram. The idea is if we begin thinking about testing, as far as left as possible, we end up really catching things that we may not have caught. Because what happens is if we wait till the very end, sometimes we're often up against deadlines and we have to ship some code. Maybe we're maybe lukewarm about, or we maybe compromise architectural things. There's lots of decisions that we end up making. So if we can think about testing from the very beginning, I think it provides a lot of value. So another thing I want to highlight here is a little guide, a table between both of these things. So we have, with end-to-end testing, what's tested, right? We have the entire app layer versus component testing. It's just an individual component. Another thing we might want to highlight is with end-to-end tests, we often see a lot of developers write them, as well as QA teams, things like that, where component tests are typically written, not that a QA person couldn't write them, but they are, you do have to have some level of framework knowledge because you're working directly with your components, which have framework information about them. So typically those are written by developers or designers, but again, it's not an exclusive statement, just generalizations. But the one thing I want to really highlight is this right here, and that The main difference when you begin writing testing beyond, or component testing beyond just sort of the mentality of what's the difference I'm testing, is how you initialize the test. So in Cypress end-to-end testing, you essentially initialize the test by visiting a URL, because you visit some URL, your home page or some, whatever the URL is, you basically say, I'm going to first start my test by visiting this place, and then you're going to scroll here, get this button, click on it, and type some information in some field, then click here, it's going to take me there. You do all your, your test stuff, but it gets initialized through a visit command. With component testing, you don't visit anything. There's no concept of routing or anything like that. Instead, you're mounting a component to the DOM. And so we'll show you what that looks like exactly, but the idea is that we're not visiting, we're mounting. Eli, ready for your demo?
Let's do it.
Oh, that's yours.
Give me a second to get situated here. Okay, and so in this demo, we're going to start off in the lab2-start branch. And so, if you're switching branches, you're going to want to make sure that your branch is clean. So feel free to either commit your changes or stash your changes or just reset your changes. Okay. And we want to get started with component testing. And so the first thing that I'm going to do is launch Cypress. Oh, actually, I think I already had Cypress loaded over here. Okay. I'm going to close out of here. I'm going to come over here to switch testing type. Because we were in end-to-end testing, now we're going to go into component testing. So what I kind of like about when you launch Cypress now, you get to almost like choose your own adventure of which way you want to go. So let's go down to component testing. We're going to do a framework detection, looking up what frameworks that you have. You can see here that we detected that the framework that you're using is Angular. So I'll hit next. And then we're going to do a check to make sure that you have all the required dependencies that's going to be needed to set up component testing. I've never seen this actually pop up and say like, hey, you need anything additional. But if something happened to be missing, it would let you know, and it would give you the commands that you would need to install it. So we'll click continue. This screen is letting us know about all the files that are going to be created on our behalf. Before we ran the Angular schematic, which kind of created all these files for end-to-end testing, but that was in the previous branch, so this branch is kind of like it hasn't been set up yet. But these are the same kind of files that got set up during the schematic. So we got the Cypress configuration file, we got the component support file, the commands file, and the component index file. And this one is worth noting because just like you have an index.html inside of your Angular app where everything gets set up, if you were to do like anything additional, you could add it here into this index file. Depending on how you're setting up your application. Sometimes you're going to set that stuff up inside the Angular JSON file. Sometimes you might import third-party assets in your TypeScript files or whatnot. But if you ever find yourself like actually putting stuff inside an index.html file, you're going to want to make sure you duplicate it here because this is the file that we're actually going to mount your Angular components into. And then an example fixture file. So we'll click continue. And once it's done, we're going to choose our browser again. I'm going to say start component testing. So off the bat, you're going to see that there's no specs found. And that's because we don't generate any example spec files because we really don't have a whole lot of idea about what components are in your project. But you might see that we're looking for this pattern here, this star.sci.ts. You might also notice if you're an old-time Cypress user is that we've changed our file format to be sci.ts instead of spec.ts. And we did that because we want your component tests to live alongside your actual code in the same folder, or at least in the same application that your components are actually in. But you might already have other types of tests in there. So you might already be using spec or whatnot. So we came up with something unique that we could find so that when we go and search for all the tests in your project, we're only going to find our Cypress tests. So let's go ahead and create a new spec. We're going to start with a simpler component, and that would be the button. And so to do so, I'm going to come up into here and I'll create a new file, and we'll call it button.component.sci.ts. So we name it pretty close to what the other one should be. And I'll use a snippet here to create a new spec, and I'm going to create the new button component, and this will be button.component. Oh, this should be say button component. There we go. And so what do we got here? We got our describe block and we got our it block, and now we're using the new command sci.mount. So we're actually taking the button component, we're going to mount it, we're going to render it inside of that index.html file, and then from here you can write actual tests against it. If I go back over into the test runner, you can see that the spec automatically appeared for us. We'll go ahead and click next, and of course I am going to get an error. Yeah, this was something when Angular 14.2 came out late last week. It broke us, and we had to do a quick patch to Cypress. So let me install that real quick. npmi Cypress at latest. Hopefully you don't run into this because you're installing your node modules fresh right now. I'm working with node modules I probably had in here for a week, so. Okay, and we'll open up Cypress again. So now we're on 10.7. Go back into component testing. There we go. And now we are mounting a button component, but you might see it looks a little bit odd right now. And that's because our button component expects some text to be passed in as the inner element to the button to be able to display. And we're going to want to pass that in. And there's a couple ways to do so. I'm going to show you one way right now. And so you don't have to see me type a lot of code. I'm actually going to come in here into the lab and copy the code. Okay, and I'll import a component from Angular core. And so what we're doing here is we're using a wrapper component. And so inside of the wrapper component, I'm actually passing in the button with the text that I want to render with. And then instead of mounting the button component, I'm going to mount the wrapper. And then I can write my tests against it, because both of these components will be rendered. When I use this method, I need to make sure that I declare my button component so Angular knows how to tie the template back into the component to render it. And if we see this run now, we can see that it runs and it finds the text of click me and verifies it. However, we realize that having to write a wrapper component for a situation as simple as this probably isn't ideal. And so we also support a different type of syntax that you can use as well. And we call this the template syntax. And this syntax is a lot like how you write your components inside of an Angular template. And so to use this, we'll pass in a string, and then we'll just say app-button. And we'll provide the text click me. And then close it back out. And the test now passes the way that it should. So this code is a little bit less verbose than the other method. But one of the drawbacks is since Angular needs to know how to tie this app dash button to the actual component, so you still have to pass it in as a declaration. We'll see in a little bit in the next lab how we can do all this in a central place so you don't have to repeat this in every single test. But just know that if you're using the template syntax, you still have to provide everything in declarations. Okay, and so I think the next thing that we want to check out here is testing some inputs into our button. And so the button, let's actually take a look at the code here real quick. The button has several different inputs. And we're going to take a look at the focus input because that one seems a little bit interesting. And what this does is if you pass in true for this input, it's going to gain focus so that you could quickly click enter or whatnot when it's not inside of a form. So let's test to make sure that works. So I'll go back into the test and we'll create a new test and we'll say, hey, it should have, let's test that it doesn't have focus first. Should not have focus. And so you don't have to see me type a bunch. I'm just going to copy up here. And so we won't pass in focus. And what we'll do is we'll say we'll get the button and it should not have focus. Come over here back to the test runner. And you can see that the test did pass. Now let's write the opposite test, that it should have focus when it's passed in. Copy this test, bring it down here, and we'll say should have focus. And then we'll say something like when focus input is true. And so we'll say app button, and then we'll pass in focus equals true. And then here, instead of saying should not, we'll say should have focus. Are they having a party next door or what? Okay, and so now we got 2 passing tests right there. Now, another common scenario that you're going to want to test when you're doing a component test is testing outputs. Making sure that when we have an output that emits event, that it actually emits when it's supposed to, and if it's passing any type of values, that it's passing those values that it's supposed to. Now I'll come over here into here and copy out the code for it. That's the focus one. Okay, here we're saying so it should respond to an onClick event. So our button component has an output named onClick that is an event emitter. And the way that we tie this up is that we have this component properties. And you pass in the component properties. These could be inputs, these can be outputs, whatever it's passing in is going to be bound to that particular component. And so we're kind of simulating an event emitter here, and that's why I'm casting it as any, because I don't have to go through and define everything that's in there to satisfy the interface. But what we're most interested in here is the emit event. And so we're going to use a Cypress spy here to see if it fires or not. And a Cypress spy lets us kind of inspect method calls to a certain method. So we can be like, hey, were you called? How many times were you called? What parameters were you called with? We can write tests to verify all those things. And so we'll set it as a spy. We'll click the button, and you can see here this is setting up an alias so we can access it later. And this is how we access it. We say sci.get, and then we pass in the @ symbol at the beginning, and this represents the alias on-click spy. And we're saying, hey, this spy should have been called. Let's give that a look. And you can see it runs so fast that it's done by the time I actually get back to it. But we'll take a look, and we can see that after we clicked, the spy did get called. And when we inserted on it, we can see that it expected to have been called at least once, and it was. This syntax right here, though, once again, is a little verbose, and we realize that. And so instead of having to write this like this, we have a helper function that you can import that will create an event emitter for you. And this is called create output spy. And then you pass it in the name of the spy that you want to alias to, so on-click spy. So this basically does the same thing that I just showed you, but in one line instead of 3. All right, and so now we're going to break into the second lab. So the second lab, make sure you go into the lab2-start folder. You don't need to run the server for component testing, yay component testing. It's a lot easier to get up and running, but you do need to make sure that you can at least pull up your Angular app will run. So if you're still having issues npm installing the Angular app, let us know. We'll come by and try to help you out.
Make sure that check out the lab2-start.
Yeah, the lab2-start branch is where you want to be for this particular lab. Oh, I got too much stuff open here. Close that. I can close the migrator. Let's pull up my Gmail in front of everybody. What's that?
Because I did this while you were typing, so I did the same things, and now there's nothing else to do.
So,
I
sorry.
already have this. So,
Sorry, let me get my mic turned off here real quick. Okay, now that we saw what it's like to test a simple component, let's dive into a bit of a more complex component. And so here we're going to be learning about a few different concepts that we have of creating a custom mount command, how to do dependency injection so you can mock dependencies into your components, and how to use sci.intercept so you can mock HTTP requests that your components might be making. If you finished the lab, lab 2, lab 3 is actually a continuation. So if you finished it, you don't need to worry about checking anything out. If you didn't finish it and you want to start at lab 3, you can go straight to the lab 3 start branch. But what we're going to want to do is test the login form for the site. And so the login form is going to be a pretty good example for some of these concepts because of all the things that it has going on for it. So I'm going to come down here to login form and create a new spec. Oh, come on now. Okay, here we go. And so I'm importing my login form component, mounting the login form component, and I'm going to use the actual template syntax. And so this will be app-login-form. And this is a string, so I need to make sure it gets enclosed in quotes. And let's see what happens when this runs. I'm going to switch specs by coming over here to the specs item here in the menu, and then come down to the login form and click it. And you can see that we are mounting the login form, but not a whole lot is happening yet. And if you recall, who can recall maybe why this isn't happening? Need to declare it. That guy right there, he gets a hat. Yeah. Who has the hats? Yeah. All right, so let's go ahead and add the declaration into here. That's not what it looks like. And so we'll add in the login form component. Save it, give it a run again. What am I missing? Jordan, what did you do? Decorations.
You're missing
Nope. I'm missing a bracket right there. There we go. All right, and now we're getting another type of error. And if you've ever been doing Angular development before and you tried to make an HTTP request, you might have seen this. And so just like we have to do with our Angular applications, when we're writing component tests, we need to make sure that everything that we need loaded into Angular is also going to be loaded. And so I could also come down here. This object right here is kind of like a little mini module that you can import. You can add all your imports, declarations, providers, all that fun stuff. However, I don't want every single test that I'm going to have in here to have all this stuff listed. So I'm going to show you how we can abstract out this away and use a custom sci.mount command to do this for us. All my things keep disappearing. Why? Here we go. Okay, and so a custom sci.mount command, you're going to define these in the support file. And the support file can be found in the Cypress folder under support and then component.ts. And so this is where you add all of your custom commands to your project. And custom commands are just Cypress commands. You can define them yourself, so you can say sci.whatever I want to do kind of like repeatable stuff. It's almost like declaring your own functions, but you're wrapping them in Cypress. And we add one for you out of the box. This is the one that we've been using all along, the sci.mount command. But all that we're doing is we're passing in the mount from the Angular package. But we're going to get rid of this, and we're going to create our own. And so this looks a little scary at first, but let me walk you through it. So I'm adding a new mount command, passing in the same parameters that I am before. But down here, I am now declaring all the different components that I'm going to be using in my login form, as well as all the different imports I'm going to be using as well. And then we're going to call the underlying mount function and pass those in. So in the component, I no longer need to pass in this config object because it's going to be ran for me. Here we go. Now we got a working login form. Now, the way that this Heroes app is built is that all of our components actually belong to their own components module. And so I could import that components module, and it imports everything that I need as well. So if you architect your app that way, it could kind of make your mount commands a little bit cleaner. The lab's going to go through on how to do that. I'm going to skip it for now because it's just kind of showing you the same exact thing I showed you, just importing something different. Okay. So next, we got a login form here, and our login form has several different requirements. The first thing that we're going to want to do is test to make sure that the validation works on it. Since we're using Cypress, one of the advantages that we have is our tests render it in an actual browser. And with an actual browser, we can actually come over here and play with the components and sign in and all that other fun stuff. Stuff that you would normally have to mount your component into a page in your app to do, you can now do it inside of Cypress. But we want to test to make sure that, hey, when these fields are blank and the sign in button is clicked, that we actually get these required messages. And come down here to form validation. And add the new test. So we're going to mount the login form, we're going to get the button, and we're going to use the contain sign in to just to make double sure that the button that we're selecting is the sign in button. And then we're going to click it, and then we're going to run a side.contains, and this is just checking to see, hey, does this text exist somewhere inside of the app? Email is required and password is required. If you're kind of used to writing end-to-end tests, you might be a little alarmed by how loose these selectors are. But because we're inside of a component test, we don't have to worry about all the other stuff on the page that might have the same text or the same class that we're trying to select or anything like that. We can write just easier selectors. And there we go. So I clicked it, and if we go through here through the time travel debugging, we can see we mounted it, we got the button, we clicked it, the validation messages appeared, and then we verified that they both existed. Great, so the next test that we're going to run I'm going to minimize this. There we go. Is write a quick test here to verify that the email address is a valid email address when it's entered. So if we come up here and we just put in stuff here, we'll see that we have an email validation message as well. So this is kind of the same deal. Something that's a little bit different is how I'm selecting the email input. And so I'm selecting an input, but then I'm looking for a type of email. Typing in an invalid email address, clicking the button, and then verifying that that message actually pulls up. Okay, and there we go. We got that test passing. And the next one that we're going to want to check is that the form is not submitted when it's invalid. And so if we click that submit button, we want to make sure that it doesn't get called. And the way that we're going to do that here is when the form is valid, it's going to call into an authentication service and pass in the username and password to do an authentication. Now we can think about testing this a couple of different ways. One way that we're going to look at first is actually how do we mock the authentication service so we can spy on its methods. Okay, and so I'll import this one. And so our test is should not try to authenticate if the form fields are invalid. And so we're able to tie into Angular's dependency injection system here. And in the providers, we can pass in an auth service, but instead of it creating its own auth service, we're telling it, hey, use this value instead. And we're not passing in the entire auth service. The only method that we're worried about here is the login method. And so we're going to set it up with another spy like we saw last time. And so when we do this and we call the button and we click it without filling in any of the forms, we want to ensure that login spy should not have been called. And there we go. The next test is going to show a different mechanism that you can use for mocking. And that is, we're going to let it actually use a real authentication service, and the authentication service is going to make HTTP calls to our back end. However, we're doing component testing here, so we don't have a back end to hit. Instead, we're going to intercept those HTTP requests and provide our own mocked responses for those HTTP requests. Okay, so here we have, should show a bad login message when the credentials are invalid. And so this site.intercept, this is setting up the HTTP mock that we want to use. So we're going to say like, hey, when there's a post request to the /auth endpoint, we want to return back a status code of 401. And so this kind of leaves us writing the test a little bit cleaner than the mocking the auth service example. And when it's done, we test that the invalid username or password is called. Okay. And so here we go, we got the mock, and we can see right here, we can see that our mock was being called and it's being verified, and it passed back a post 401. And because we got back a 401 status code, we got an invalid username or password error message. Now the next example is going to show, hey, what does this look like when it is a valid username or password? Now when it's a valid username or password, our server is going to return back a status code at 200. So we're going to mock that. It's going to go through and mock it. And then something else that happens when authentication is successful is that we have an event emitter called onLogin that's going to get called. So just like what we saw in the button example where we set up a spy on the onClick, we're going to set up one here for onLogin, and we're going to use that create output spy. Okay, and once it goes through, here we go, and we can see now that when it tried to make that HTTP request, we intercepted it and returned back a status code of 200 instead. All right, and that will take us to the next portion of the lab. So remember, when you're starting off here, if you're continuing from lab 2, you can go ahead and stay in that branch. If you want to start fresh, make sure you go into and you check out the lab 3-start branch. Okay, everybody, we are about ending our time here, but we are the last session of the day, so I don't know if we're having anybody kick us out unless Joe's going to, say shoot, or anything like that. So I think you could probably feel free and wrap up. We're going to be sticking around a little bit, so if you have any additional questions for us, please come and ask. And once again, tomorrow we're going to be at the speaker meet and greet. It's in the schedule. I don't recall what time it is offhand, but it's in the schedule. And if you have any questions about Cypress, come feel free to join us.
We have 2 hats to give away. Who wants a hat? Okay. I'm just going to throw them.
Okay.
Is this a violation or something? Am I allowed to throw these hats? Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
That was literally the one thing to not do.
There we go.
There we go. Sorry, people in the back.
Yeah. Thank you, guys.
Yes.